The letter arrived on a gray November morning, tucked between a utility bill and a credit card offer that promised more than it could deliver. Daniel Weston almost threw it away without looking, his eyes bleary from another sleepless night, his mind dulled by the medication that kept the worst of his demons at bay. But something about the envelope caught his attention. Perhaps the formal script of his name, or the return address from a law firm in a town he had never heard of called Ridgewood, Oregon. He set down his coffee and opened the envelope with hands that trembled slightly, a tremor that had become his constant companion since the blast in Fallujah that had ended his military career and nearly ended his life. Inside was a single page, crisp and official, informing him that his father, William Robert Weston, had died 3 weeks ago at the age of 78, and that as his sole surviving heir, Daniel was entitled to his estate. Daniel read the letter 3 times, certain that there must be some mistake. His father had died 15 years ago, or so he had been told. His mother had called him at his base in Germany with the news, her voice flat and emotionless as she explained that William had suffered a heart attack and been buried before Daniel could get leave to attend the funeral. There had been no body to view, no grave to visit, no closure of any kind. Just the stark fact of his father's death and the expectation that Daniel would somehow process this loss from thousands of miles away. But this letter told a different story. According to the law firm of Morrison and Associates, William Weston had been very much alive until 3 weeks ago, living in a cabin on a cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean in a remote corner of Oregon. He had died peacefully in his sleep, leaving behind a property that was now Daniel's responsibility to claim or dispose of as he saw fit. Daniel's first reaction was disbelief, followed quickly by a rage so intense that it made his vision blur. His mother had lied to him. For 15 years she had allowed him to believe that his father was dead, had watched him grieve and struggle and question everything without ever telling him the truth. And his father, wherever he had been, had made no attempt to contact his son, had let Daniel believe he was mourning a man who was still alive. The betrayal was so complete, so incomprehensible, that Daniel couldn't process it. He sat at his kitchen table for hours, the letter clutched in his hands, trying to make sense of a reality that had just been shattered beyond repair. His dog, a Belgian Malinois named Ghost, sensed his distress and pressed against his leg, offering the wordless comfort that had sustained Daniel through countless dark moments since he had adopted the retired military working dog 4 years ago. Ghost was 8 years old, a veteran like Daniel with 3 tours in Afghanistan and a purple heart that he wore as a scar across his muzzle where shrapnel had torn through his face. The Army had been going to euthanize him after his injury, deeming him unfit for service and too dangerous for adoption due to the behavioral issues that sometimes developed in traumatized working dogs. But Daniel had intervened, had pulled strings and called in favors, had refused to let his fellow warrior be discarded like a broken piece of equipment. The decision had saved both their lives. Ghost had given Daniel a reason to get out of bed in the morning, a companion who understood the particular kind of brokenness that came from combat, a presence that grounded him when the flashbacks threatened to drag him under. And Daniel had given Ghost a home, a purpose, a second chance at a life that had almost been taken from him. Now they sat together in the small apartment that Daniel had called home for the past 3 years, man and dog processing a revelation that changed everything Daniel thought he knew about his past. His father was dead, but he had only been dead for 3 weeks. His father had been alive, living in a cabin somewhere in Oregon for 15 years while Daniel believed he was grieving. Why? The question echoed through Daniel's mind, demanding an answer that the letter couldn't provide. Why had his mother lied? Why had his father disappeared? What had happened to tear his family apart so completely that they had staged a death rather than tell him the truth? There was only one way to find out. Daniel had to go to Oregon, had to see this cabin where his father had spent his final years, had to search for the answers that had been hidden from him for so long. The letter said he had 30 days to claim the estate before it would be turned over to the state. He had no intention of waiting that long. The drive from his apartment in San Diego to Ridgewood, Oregon took nearly 14 hours, broken up by rest stops where Ghost could stretch his legs and Daniel could try to quiet the thoughts racing through his mind. He drove through the night, unable to sleep even when exhaustion made his eyes burn, the questions that had no answers keeping him alert long past the point of reason. Ridgewood was a tiny town, barely more than a crossroads, with a general store, a post office, and a handful of houses that clung to the hillside overlooking the ocean. The law firm was located in a converted Victorian house on Main Street, its sign swinging gently in the salt-tinged breeze that blew in from the Pacific. Harold Morrison was an elderly man with white hair and kind eyes that seemed to hold a sadness that went beyond professional sympathy. He welcomed Daniel into his office and offered him coffee that Daniel declined, too anxious to sit still for the pleasantries that the situation seemed to require. "I knew your father," Harold said, settling into the chair behind his desk. "Not well, but as well as anyone in town did. He was a private man, kept to himself mostly, but he was a good neighbor, helped out when he could, never caused any trouble." Daniel nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The image of his father as a reclusive old man in a seaside town didn't match his memories of the larger-than-life figure who had dominated his childhood. "He talked about you sometimes," Harold continued. "He had pictures of you in the cabin, from when you were young and from your time in the service. He was proud of you, I could tell. But there was a sadness in him when he spoke about you, a regret that he never quite explained." Daniel's throat tightened. "He never tried to contact me, not once in 15 years. "No," Harold agreed. "He didn't. I asked him about it once, whether he had any family he wanted to inform about his situation. He just shook his head and said that some bridges, once burned, couldn't be rebuilt. I didn't press him. It wasn't my place." The papers were signed quickly, the transfer of ownership completed with a minimum of fuss. The cabin and its contents now belonged to Daniel, along with a small savings account that would cover the property taxes for several years. Harold handed him a set of keys and a hand-drawn map showing how to reach the property. "It's about 5 miles up the coast road," he explained. "The turnoff is easy to miss, just a dirt path through the trees. The cabin sits on a cliff about 200 feet above the water. Beautiful views, but isolated. Your father liked it that way." Daniel thanked him and took the keys, feeling their weight in his palm like a promise or a threat. Ghost was waiting in the truck, his head hanging out the window, his nose working the salt air with a focus that had made him one of the Army's best detection dogs. The drive to the cabin was beautiful and terrifying, the road winding along cliffs that dropped away to crashing waves far below. Daniel's hands gripped the steering wheel with unnecessary force. His body tensed against dangers that existed only in his mind. Ghost sensed his distress and placed a paw on his thigh, the familiar gesture helping to ground Daniel in the present. The turnoff was exactly where Harold had said it would be, a narrow dirt path that disappeared into a forest of towering pines. Daniel eased the truck onto the path and drove slowly, the branches scraping against the sides of the vehicle, the world narrowing to this single track through the trees. And then, suddenly, the forest opened up and the cabin appeared. It was smaller than Daniel had expected, a simple structure of weathered wood and stone that seemed to grow out of the cliff on which it sat. A covered porch wrapped around 3 sides, offering views of the ocean that stretched to the horizon in every direction. The windows were dark, the chimney cold, the whole place wearing the particular stillness of a home whose owner had departed and would not return. Daniel sat in the truck for a long moment, staring at the cabin where his father had lived and died, trying to reconcile this reality with the one he had believed for 15 years. Ghost whined softly, eager to explore, but Daniel needed another minute, needed to gather himself before he walked through the door and confronted whatever waited for him inside. The key turned in the lock with a click that seemed to echo across the empty landscape. Daniel pushed the door open and stepped into the darkness, Ghost padding silently at his side. The smell hit him first, the particular combination of wood smoke and old books and something else, something that triggered memories of his childhood that he had buried so deep he had almost forgotten they existed. His father's smell. After 15 years, the cabin still smelled of the man who had raised him, had taught him to throw a ball and ride a bike and stand up for himself when the world tried to knock him down. The grief that Daniel had suppressed since reading the letter finally broke through his defenses, and he stood in the doorway weeping for a father he had lost twice, once to a lie and once to death. Ghost pressed against him, offering comfort, giving Daniel something solid to hold on to as the waves of emotion crashed over him. The dog didn't understand the specifics of what was happening, but he understood pain, understood loss, understood the particular kind of suffering that came from wounds that couldn't be seen. When Daniel finally collected himself enough to move, he found the light switch and illuminated the cabin's interior. What he saw made him catch his breath. The walls were covered with photographs, dozens of them, tracing Daniel's life from infancy to adulthood. There he was as a baby, held in his father's arms, both of them beaming at the camera. There he was at 5, riding a bike with training wheels, his father running alongside with a hand on the seat. There he was at 10, in his Little League uniform, holding a trophy that Daniel had forgotten he ever won. And there he was, in uniform, the official photo from his enlistment, young and proud and unaware of the horrors that awaited him. His father had been watching. His father had been collecting these images, tracking Daniel's life from a distance, maintaining a connection that Daniel hadn't known existed. The realization was both comforting and devastating, proof of love and evidence of a separation that had never needed to happen. Ghost was already exploring, his nose working the floor and the furniture, cataloging the scents that filled this space. The dog paused at a closed door near the back of the cabin, his body suddenly rigid, his focus sharpening in a way that Daniel recognized from their years together. Something was behind that door, something that Ghost's trained nose had detected, something that demanded investigation. Daniel approached the door slowly, his heart pounding with an anxiety that seemed disproportionate to the situation. It was probably just a storage room, just more evidence of his father's solitary life, but Ghost's reaction suggested something more, something significant, something that had been hidden away for reasons Daniel couldn't yet understand. He opened the door. The room beyond was small, barely more than a closet, but it had been transformed into something that made Daniel's blood run cold. The walls were covered with newspaper clippings, photographs, maps, and documents, all centered around a single subject: Daniel himself. Every article that had ever been written about his military service was there, from the small-town newspaper that had covered his enlistment to the national publications that have reported on the battle where he had earned his Silver Star. Every photograph that had appeared in any media source was pinned to the wall, along with copies of his service records that shouldn't have been available to civilians. Maps showed every base where he had been stationed, every country where he had served, every location where he had been deployed. It was obsessive, it was comprehensive, it was the work of a man who had dedicated years to tracking his son's life from the shadows. But that wasn't what had triggered Ghost's alert. The dog was pawing at the floor in the corner of the room, at a section of wooden boards that looked slightly different from the rest. Daniel knelt beside him, running his hands over the floor, and felt the seam that indicated a hidden compartment. The boards came up easily, revealing a space below that contained a metal box about the size of a small suitcase. Daniel lifted it out, feeling its weight, knowing with absolute certainty that whatever was inside would change everything. The box was locked, but the key was on the ring that Harold Morrison had given him, a small brass key that Daniel hadn't noticed before. He inserted it into the lock and turned, hearing the mechanism click open, then lifted the lid to reveal what his father had hidden away. Inside were letters, Hundreds of them, stacked neatly, organized by date, spanning the 15 years since Daniel had believed his father was dead. Some were written in his father's handwriting, pages and pages of words that had never been sent. Others were official documents, medical records, and legal papers that told a story Daniel was only beginning to understand. He picked up the first letter, dated just days after the date his mother had told him his father had died, and began to read. "My dear son," his father had written, "by the time you read this, I will truly be gone. But I need you to know the truth about why I left, why I let you believe I was dead, why I spent the last years of my life watching you from a distance instead of being the father you deserved." It started with a diagnosis. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer, they told me. 6 months to live, maybe less. Your mother and I made a decision that we thought was right at the time, a decision that I have regretted every day since. We decided that it would be easier for you to grieve me quickly, to believe I was gone, rather than watch me waste away over months of suffering. I was going to die, Daniel. That was certain. And I couldn't bear the thought of you watching it happen, of you abandoning your duties to sit beside my bed, of you carrying the weight of my slow death on top of everything else you were carrying. So we staged my funeral, and I came here, to this cabin where I planned to spend my final months alone. But I didn't die. The doctors were wrong, or God had other plans, or the universe decided that my punishment was to live with the consequences of my choice. The cancer went into remission, then disappeared entirely. I was given a second chance at life, but I had already destroyed my chance at a life with you. How could I come back? How could I tell you that I had let you grieve for nothing, that I had abandoned you based on a death sentence that never came? Your mother begged me to return, to tell you the truth, but I was too ashamed. I had made my choice, and I felt I had to live with it. So I watched from afar. I followed your career, celebrated your achievements, wept at your injuries. When you were hurt in Fallujah, I almost came to you. I drove to the hospital, stood in the parking lot, tried to work up the courage to walk through the doors. But I couldn't. I had been dead to you for so long that I didn't know how to come back to life. I am a coward, Daniel. I have always been a coward. And my cowardice cost me the chance to be your father when you needed me most. I don't ask for your forgiveness because I don't deserve it. I only ask that you understand why I did what I did, and that somewhere in your heart you know that I never stopped loving you, not for a single moment of the 15 years I spent in exile. The letter continued for several more pages, detailing the years of watching and waiting, the endless second-guessing, the moments when his father had almost reached out only to pull back at the last second. It was a chronicle of regret, a confession of a man who had made a terrible choice and spent the rest of his life paying for it. Daniel read every word, then set the letter aside and picked up the next one and the next, working his way through the years of silence that his father had filled with words that were never sent. Each letter was addressed to Daniel, each one written as if his father expected him to read it someday, each one adding layers to a story that broke Daniel's heart in ways he hadn't known were possible. Ghost lay beside him as he read, the dog's presence a comfort in the midst of the emotional storm. Hours passed, the light outside shifting from afternoon to evening to darkness, and still Daniel read, unable to stop, needing to understand everything that had happened and everything that had been lost. The medical records told their own part of the story. His father had indeed been diagnosed with terminal cancer in 2008, had indeed been given months to live. The remission had been unexpected, unexplainable, a miracle that had felt more like a curse to a man who had already said goodbye to everything he loved. But there was more in the box, documents that went beyond his father's illness and exile. There were records related to Daniel's mother, records that revealed a truth even more devastating than the one he had already uncovered. His mother had known. She had known from the beginning that his father was alive. She had visited him here at the cabin at least once a year, had been part of the deception, had watched Daniel struggle with grief that was based on a lie, and never said a word. The evidence was undeniable. Photographs of his parents together, dated years after his father's supposed death. Letters between them discussing Daniel, debating whether to tell him the truth, always deciding that the revelation would cause more harm than good. Financial records showing money transferred from his father's account to his mother, supporting her in ways that Daniel had attributed to insurance policies and savings. They had both been lying to him. His entire family had conspired to make him believe he was alone in the world when his father was alive and his mother was complicit in the deception. The betrayal was complete, involving everyone Daniel had trusted, leaving him with questions that might never be fully answered. Ghost stirred beside him, lifting his head, his attention suddenly focused on something beyond the walls of the cabin. Daniel listened, his combat instincts activating despite the years that had passed since he had needed them, but he heard nothing unusual, just the wind in the trees and the distant crash of waves against the cliffs below. But Ghost was insistent. The dog rose and padded to the door, then looked back at Daniel with an expression that clearly communicated that they needed to go outside. Daniel had learned to trust Ghost's instincts, had seen them prove accurate too many times to dismiss them now. He set aside the letters and followed the dog out into the night. The moon was full, casting silver light across the landscape, illuminating the path that led from the cabin toward the edge of the cliff. Ghost moved along this path with purpose, his nose low to the ground, tracking a scent that had captured his attention. Daniel followed, his heart pounding with an anticipation that he couldn't explain. The path ended at a small clearing near the cliff's edge, a spot that offered an unobstructed view of the ocean spread out below. There was a bench here, handmade from logs that had been smoothed and joined with obvious care, and beside the bench, partially hidden by the tall grass that had grown up around it, was a stone marker that made Daniel's breath catch in his throat. It was a grave. The marker was simple, just a flat stone with words carved into its surface by what must have been his father's own hand. The letters were uneven, the work of an amateur, but the message was clear enough to read in the moonlight. "Here lies my heart, buried with the son I lost. May God forgive me for the choice I made." Daniel knelt beside the marker, his hands trembling, his mind racing to understand what he was seeing. This wasn't a real grave, he realized. His father's body was at the funeral home in town, waiting for Daniel to make arrangements for its final disposition. This was a symbolic grave, a monument to the relationship that his father had destroyed with his deception. Ghost was still sniffing around the area, his focus intensifying as he approached a spot a few feet from the marker. The dog began to dig, his paws working the soft earth, unearthing something that had been buried beneath the surface. Daniel watched, too numb to intervene, as Ghost uncovered another metal box, smaller than the one in the cabin but similar in construction. The dog sat back, looking to Daniel with an expression that seemed to say his work was done, and waited for his human to complete the discovery. The box was not locked. Daniel opened it with trembling hands and found a collection of objects that told a story he had never known. There were photographs, but not of Daniel. These were older, faded, showing a young couple with 2 children, a boy and a girl. The boy looked like Daniel, the same features, the same expression, but he was not Daniel. He was someone else, someone from a past that Daniel had never been told about. There was a birth certificate for a child named Thomas William Weston, born in 1970, 2 years before Daniel himself. There was a death certificate for the same child, dated 1975, listing the cause of death as accidental drowning. And there was a photograph of a small grave marker, similar to the one that stood beside Daniel now, in a cemetery that he had never seen. Daniel had had a brother who had died before Daniel was born, a brother whose existence had never been mentioned, a brother whose loss had apparently shaped everything that followed. The final item in the box was a letter addressed to Daniel in his father's handwriting, with instructions on the envelope that it should be opened only after everything else had been read. Daniel opened it with hands that had stopped trembling, his emotions now so overwhelming that they had circled back to a strange kind of calm. The letter was shorter than the others, just a few paragraphs, but it explained everything. Daniel, his father had written, "If you found this box, then you found the truth that I could never bring myself to tell you. You had a brother named Thomas, and he died when he was 5 years old. I was supposed to be watching him, but I looked away for just a moment and he fell into the pond behind our house. By the time I got to him, it was too late. I never forgave myself for Thomas's death. I carried that guilt every day of my life, and it shaped the kind of father I was to you. I was overprotective, terrified of losing you the way I had lost him. I couldn't bear to let you take risks, couldn't stand to see you in danger, couldn't accept that you had the right to live your own life. When you enlisted, I was proud, but I was also terrified. Every day you were deployed, I lived in fear of the phone call that would tell me I had lost another son. And when I was diagnosed with cancer, when I believed I was going to die, all I could think about was how I would have to watch you grieve for me the way you would have grieved for Thomas if you had known him. I couldn't do it, Daniel. I couldn't put you through that pain, couldn't watch your face as you watched me die. So I made the worst decision of my life. I let you grieve quickly, let you believe I was gone, spared you the slow agony of a death that never came. But I realized too late that the quick grief was worse. I saw what it did to you, how you closed yourself off, how you stopped trusting people, how you carried the weight of my supposed death alongside everything else you had to carry. I wanted to protect you, but I only hurt you more. Thomas's grave is in a cemetery in your hometown. I visit him every year on the anniversary of his death, the one day I allow myself to remember what I lost and what I caused. I never told you about him because I didn't know how, because the words always stuck in my throat, because the shame of that day has never left me. You deserved to know about your brother. You deserved to know the truth about me. You deserved a father who was present, who was honest, who didn't let fear control his every decision. Instead, you got a father who watched from the shadows, who kept secrets, who loved you more than words could express, but showed it in all the wrong ways. I am sorry, Daniel. I am sorry for Thomas, for the lie about my death, for the years of silence. I am sorry for being a coward when you needed me to be brave, and I am sorry that you had to learn all of this after I was truly gone, that I couldn't find the courage to tell you while I still had the chance. Please don't hate your mother. She did what I asked her to do, and she has regretted it as much as I have. She wanted to tell you the truth so many times, but I made her promise to keep my secret. The blame for all of this lies with me. I love you, Daniel. I have always loved you, from the moment you were born until my final breath. I hope that someday, somehow, you can find it in your heart to forgive me. But if you can't, I understand. Some wounds are too deep to heal. Your father, William. Daniel sat on the bench beside his father's symbolic grave, the letter in his hands, the weight of revelation pressing down on him like a physical force. He had come here expecting to find answers, and he had found them, but the answers were more painful than the questions had ever been. Ghost settled at his feet, his warm body a comfort against the cold ocean wind. The dog didn't understand the specifics of what Daniel was feeling, but he understood pain, understood loss, understood the need for presence when words were inadequate. He leaned against Daniel's leg and stayed there, keeping watch through the long night that followed. Daniel didn't sleep. He couldn't sleep, not with everything that was churning through his mind. He thought about his father, about the man he had known and the man who had been hiding behind that facade. He thought about Thomas, the brother he had never met, the tragedy that had shaped his entire family in ways he was only now beginning to understand. He thought about his mother, about the years of deception, about the conversations they would need to have. And he thought about himself, about the choices he had made, about the walls he had built around his heart. He had blamed his emotional distance on his military service, on the trauma of combat, on the belief that he was simply wired differently than other people. But now he wondered if it went deeper than that, if the seeds of his isolation had been planted long before he ever picked up a weapon. His father had been absent even when he was present, too consumed by fear and guilt to fully connect with his surviving son. His mother had been complicit in a deception that had shattered Daniel's trust in the most fundamental way. He had grown up believing he was loved, but always sensing that something was being held back, that there was a barrier between him and his parents that he could never quite penetrate. Now he knew what that barrier was. It was Thomas, the ghost of a brother he had never known, the tragedy that his parents had never processed and never shared. It was a family's inability to face its own pain, to speak the words that needed to be spoken, to trust each other with the truth. As the sun began to rise over the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Daniel made a decision. He would stay here, at least for a while. He would go through his father's things, learn everything he could about the man who had raised him and the secrets he had kept. He would visit Thomas's grave and pay respects to the brother he had never known. And he would talk to his mother, would demand the answers that she owed him, would try to understand, even if he couldn't forgive. But first, he would honor his father's final wishes. The documents in the cabin included instructions for a simple cremation and the scattering of ashes from the cliff where his father had spent so many hours watching the ocean. Daniel would carry out these instructions, would give his father the goodbye that he had been denied, would find whatever closure was possible in this impossible situation. Ghost rose with him as Daniel stood, the dog stretching his legs after the long night of vigilance. Together, they walked back to the cabin to begin the work of sorting through a lifetime of secrets. The days that followed blurred together, a continuous process of discovery and grief that seemed to have no end. Daniel found more letters, more photographs, more evidence of his father's obsessive tracking of his life. He found journals that chronicled his father's daily existence, the loneliness and regret that had been his constant companions, the rare moments of joy when a new photograph or a news article would arrive and give him a glimpse of the son he had chosen to abandon. He found records of his father's health, the years of remission that had felt like a curse rather than a blessing. He found evidence of the anonymous donations his father had made to veterans organizations, the small acts of service that had been his way of supporting Daniel from a distance. He found the reading glasses that his father had worn, and the slippers that had been by his bed, and the coffee mug that still sat on the kitchen counter. The mundane artifacts of a life that had ended quietly and alone. Ghost was with him through all of it, the dog's presence a constant comfort in the midst of the emotional upheaval. The Belgian Malinois had developed a habit of lying beside Daniel as he read, his head resting on Daniel's thigh, his breathing steady and reassuring. Sometimes Daniel would talk to him, would share the contents of the letters he was reading, would process his feelings aloud, even though the dog couldn't respond with words. "He loved me," Daniel would say, stroking Ghost's fur. "He loved me, and he was terrified of losing me, so he lost me on purpose. How does that make any sense?" Ghost would look up at him with those intelligent brown eyes, offering no answers but providing a presence that made the questions more bearable. The call to his mother was the hardest thing Daniel had ever done, harder than any battle he had faced in his years of service. He sat on the porch of the cabin with Ghost at his feet, watching the ocean, gathering the courage to dial a number he had avoided for months, even before this revelation. She answered on the third ring, her voice cautious, uncertain why her estranged son was calling after so long. "I'm at Dad's cabin," Daniel said without preamble. "The one in Oregon. The one where he's been living for the past 15 years. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. He could hear his mother's breathing, could imagine her face as she processed the implications of his words. "Daniel," she finally said, her voice breaking, "I wanted to tell you. You have to believe me. I wanted to tell you so many times." "But you didn't. You let me believe he was dead. You watched me grieve for a man who was still alive, and you never said a word." "Your father made me promise. He was so certain he was going to die, so determined to spare you the pain of watching it happen. And then, when he didn't die, when the cancer disappeared, we were in too deep. We didn't know how to come back from the lie." "You could have tried. You could have told me the truth and dealt with the consequences. Instead, you let me build my entire adult life on a foundation of deception." His mother was crying now, her sobs coming through the phone in ragged bursts. "I'm sorry, Daniel. I'm so sorry. I know that's not enough. I know nothing I say can make up for what we did. But please believe me when I tell you that we thought we were protecting you." "I found out about Thomas," Daniel said, and the sobbing stopped abruptly. "I found the box. I know about my brother." The silence that followed was different from the first one, heavier, weighted with decades of suppressed grief. When his mother spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. "Thomas was the light of our lives. When we lost him, something in your father broke that never healed. He blamed himself, could never accept that it was an accident, that sometimes terrible things happen and no one is at fault. And when you were born, all that love he had for Thomas transferred to you, but so did all that fear. He couldn't bear the thought of losing you the way he lost Thomas." "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't either of you ever mention that I had a brother?" "Because we couldn't. Because every time we tried, the words turned to ash in our mouths. Because we were weak, Daniel. We were weak and broken, and we never found a way to heal." The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, peeling back layers of deception and grief that had accumulated over decades. Daniel learned more about Thomas, about the happy child who had loved to laugh and play, about the moment of distraction that had ended his life. He learned about his parents' marriage, how it had survived the tragedy but had been fundamentally changed by it. And he learned about the years of his father's exile, the visits his mother had made to this cabin, the guilt they had both carried for keeping Daniel in the dark. By the time he hung up the phone, Daniel was emotionally exhausted, but also strangely lighter. The truth was terrible, but it was also liberating. He no longer had to wonder what he had done wrong, why his relationship with his parents had always felt slightly off. He understood now, even if he couldn't yet forgive. Ghost seemed to sense the shift in Daniel's mood, his tail wagging slowly as Daniel scratched behind his ears. The dog had been patient through the long phone call, lying at Daniel's feet, occasionally looking up as if to check that his human was okay. Now he pressed closer, offering the comfort that only a loyal companion could provide. "Let's go for a walk, boy," Daniel said. "I need to clear my head." They walked along the cliff, following a path that Daniel's father had clearly used many times, worn smooth by the passage of years. The ocean stretched out below them, vast and indifferent, its waves crashing against the rocks with a rhythm that had been constant since before humans existed and would continue long after they were gone. Daniel thought about his father standing here, watching the same ocean, carrying the weight of secrets that he couldn't bring himself to share. He thought about Thomas, the brother who had been erased from family history as if his short life had never happened. And he thought about himself, about the choices he had made, about the walls he had built. Ghost walked beside him, occasionally pausing to sniff at something interesting before continuing on. The dog's presence was grounding, a reminder that Daniel was not alone, that he had found a companion who would stay with him no matter what.
The weeks that followed were a period of healing, slow and painful but necessary. Daniel contacted the funeral home and arranged for his father's cremation, then scattered the ashes from the cliff as the instructions had specified. He stood at the edge, watching the gray dust disappear into the wind, feeling something release inside him that had been held tight for too long.
He visited Thomas's grave, making the long drive back to his hometown to stand before a small headstone that marked a short life and an unending grief. He brought flowers, spoke words that felt inadequate, tried to connect with a brother he had never known. Ghost sat beside him, patient as always, sharing the moment in his silent way. He continued to go through his father's things, discovering more about the man who had raised him than he had ever known while his father was alive. There were journals that went back decades, documenting the inner life that his father had hidden from the world. There were projects started and abandoned, books read and annotated, evidence of a mind that had remained active even in isolation. And there was a final discovery, one that Ghost led him to on a rainy afternoon when the ocean was gray and angry and the wind howled around the cabin like a living thing. The dog had been restless all day, pacing through the cabin, returning again and again to a section of wall in the main room. Daniel had assumed there was a mouse or some other small creature that Ghost could smell but not reach. But when he finally investigated, pressing on the panels that Ghost kept nosing, he discovered that one of them was loose. Behind the panel was a small alcove, hidden by the cabin's previous construction, containing a single wooden box that had been placed there with obvious care. Daniel lifted it out and set it on the table, feeling the weight of it, sensing that whatever was inside was important. The box was not locked, just latched. Daniel opened it and found a collection of items that made his heart ache in new ways. There were baby shoes, 2 pairs, one slightly smaller than the other. Thomas's and Daniel's, he realized, saved across all the years as tangible reminders of the children his parents had loved. There were handprints in plaster, small hands preserved forever in white stone, labeled with names and dates that marked moments of innocent joy. There was a lock of hair from each of them, sealed in small envelopes with their names written in his mother's careful script. There were report cards and drawings and birthday cards, the artifacts of childhoods that had unfolded in such different ways. And at the bottom of the box, there was a photograph that Daniel had never seen before. It showed his father holding 2 children, one in each arm. The older child was Thomas, perhaps 4 years old, grinning at the camera with the carefree joy of a child who had never known loss. And the younger child was Daniel, just a baby, looking up at his father with wide eyes that were only beginning to see the world. It was the only photograph that existed of the 2 brothers together, the only evidence that they had ever shared the same space, breathed the same air, been held by the same father. Thomas had died just a few months after the photo was taken, leaving Daniel to grow up as an only child who had never known he was once part of a pair. Daniel held the photograph for a long time, studying the faces of his father and his brother, trying to imagine the life that might have been. Would things have been different if Thomas had lived? Would his father have been able to overcome his guilt and fear? Would Daniel have grown up with a brother to share the burdens that had sometimes felt too heavy to bear alone? He would never know. The what-ifs were endless, and dwelling on them served no purpose. All he could do was honor the truth he had discovered, carry forward the memory of a brother he had never known, and try to become the kind of man who didn't hide from his own pain. Ghost whined softly, pressing against Daniel's leg, reminding him that he was not alone. Daniel reached down and stroked the dog's head, grateful for the companion who had shared this journey with him. "It's okay, boy," he said. "It's okay. We're going to be okay." The decision to stay at the cabin came gradually, born from the realization that there was nothing waiting for Daniel back in San Diego. His apartment was rented, his possessions few, his connections to the city tenuous at best. Here, in this place where his father had lived and died, Daniel felt something that had been missing from his life for as long as he could remember. He felt at home. He began making improvements to the property. Small projects at first, and then larger ones as his skills developed. He repaired the roof, replaced the windows, built a proper deck that extended the living space out toward the cliff. He created a fenced area where Ghost could run without the danger of approaching the edge, and he planted a garden where his father had once grown vegetables. The work was healing in a way that nothing else had been. It gave him purpose, focused his energy, provided tangible results that he could see and touch. Each board he nailed, each plant he cultivated, each improvement he made was a way of honoring his father's memory while also claiming the space as his own. Ghost thrived in this environment, the open space and fresh air a far cry from the cramped apartment they had shared in the city. The dog spent hours exploring the property, chasing rabbits he never caught, barking at seagulls that swooped too close. At night, he would curl up on a bed that Daniel had made specifically for him, positioned near the wood stove where the warmth collected. Daniel started writing, something he had never done before but felt compelled to do now. He wrote about his father, about Thomas, about the secrets that had shaped his family. He wrote about his own experiences in combat, the things he had seen and done that had never fit into words before. And he wrote about Ghost, about the bond between a man and his dog that had sustained him through the darkest periods of his life. The writing was difficult, pulling up emotions that had been buried for years, forcing him to confront truths that he had avoided for too long. But it was also liberating, a way of processing everything that had happened and making sense of a life that had often felt senseless. He began sharing pieces of his writing online, first anonymously and then under his own name. The response was overwhelming, veterans reaching out to say that his words had helped them feel less alone, families of veterans expressing gratitude for a glimpse into experiences they had never understood. What had started as a private form of therapy became something larger, a way of connecting with others who were walking similar paths. The first anniversary of his father's death arrived on a gray November day that felt appropriate for the occasion. Daniel hiked to the spot where he had scattered the ashes, Ghost at his side, and stood looking out at the ocean that his father had loved. "I'm still angry," he said aloud, speaking to the wind and the waves and whatever part of his father might still be listening. "I'm still hurt by what you did, by the years you stole from us. But I'm also grateful. Grateful for this place. Grateful for the truth. Grateful for the chance to understand, even if I can't forgive." Ghost leaned against his leg, the familiar gesture of comfort that had sustained Daniel through so many difficult moments. The dog didn't understand the words, but he understood the emotion behind them, the complex mix of grief and healing that had characterized this past year. "I've found a family up here," Daniel continued. "Not the family I lost, but a new one. There's a woman who runs the general store, a widow named Helen who lost her husband to cancer 5 years ago. We've been talking, and I think there might be something there, something worth exploring. And there's a group of veterans who meet at the church in town, men and women who've been through what I've been through. They've welcomed me in, made me feel like I belong. I have Ghost, of course. He's been with me through everything, the best friend I've ever had. And I have this cabin, this place you built for yourself, but that somehow feels like it was always meant to be mine. I'm gonna be okay, Dad. I'm gonna carry forward the memory of you and Thomas. Gonna make sure that the mistakes of the past don't define the future. I'm gonna live a life that would make you proud. Not because you deserve it, but because I do." Ghost barked once, a sound that might have been agreement or simply a response to a seagull passing overhead. Daniel smiled and scratched behind the dog's ears. "Come on, boy. Let's go home." The cabin had become more than a home. It had become a sanctuary for veterans who needed a place to heal, a retreat where those who had served could find the peace that civilian life often denied them. Daniel had started offering the space informally, inviting fellow veterans to stay for a few days when they were struggling, providing a quiet place away from the chaos of the world. The word spread through the veteran community, and soon Daniel was hosting regular retreats, week-long programs where small groups would come together to share their experiences and support each other. Ghost became an integral part of these programs, his calm presence helping to ease the anxiety that many participants felt. The dog seemed to have an instinct for who needed comfort, would position himself beside those who were struggling, would offer his warmth without judgment or expectation. Helen, the woman from the general store, became Daniel's partner in this work. Her own experience with loss gave her a unique understanding of what the veterans were going through, and her practical skills helped keep the retreats organized and running smoothly. Their relationship deepened over time, growing from friendship into something more, a connection that neither of them had expected, but both of them embraced. Daniel's writing continued to reach people, his blog becoming a resource for veterans and their families across the country. He was invited to speak at conferences and support groups, sharing his story and the lessons he had learned. Each time he spoke about his father's secrets, about the heartbreaking truth that Ghost had helped him uncover, he saw faces in the audience that mirrored his own journey. "The secrets we keep don't protect anyone," he would say. "They just create distance where there should be connection. My father thought he was protecting me by hiding the truth, but all he did was build walls between us that took years to tear down. If you're carrying secrets, if you're hiding parts of yourself from the people who love you, I urge you to find the courage to speak. The truth may hurt, but it's the only foundation on which real relationships can be built." Ghost was always with him when he spoke, lying at his feet, a living reminder of the companion who had been with Daniel through every step of this journey. The dog had aged in the years since they first arrived at the cabin, his muzzle now gray, his movements slower than they had once been. But his spirit remained strong, his devotion to Daniel unwavering. On the 5th anniversary of his father's death, Daniel received a visit that brought everything full circle. His mother arrived at the cabin, the first time she had been there since his father's passing, coming to face the place where her husband had spent his final years. She was older than Daniel remembered, the years of carrying secrets having taken their toll, but there was also a lightness about her that he hadn't seen before, a release that had come from finally sharing the truth. Their relationship had been slowly rebuilding since the revelations, difficult conversations giving way to tentative reconnection. They walked to the cliff together, Daniel and his mother and Ghost, standing at the spot where Daniel had scattered his father's ashes. The ocean was calm today, reflecting the blue of the sky, endless and eternal. "He loved this view," his mother said softly. "He used to talk about it when he called, would describe the colors of the sunset, the sound of the waves. I think he found peace here, as much as he was capable of finding peace." "Did you ever forgive him?" Daniel asked. "For everything?" His mother was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. "Forgiveness isn't a single moment," she finally said. "It's a process, a choice you make again and again. Some days I have forgiven him. Other days the anger comes back and I have to start over. But I've learned that holding on to resentment hurts me more than it hurts him. He's beyond my anger now. All I can do is try to move forward." Daniel nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. He had walked the same path, had struggled with the same emotions, had learned the same lessons. Forgiveness wasn't about the other person. It was about freeing yourself from the weight of what they had done. "I want to show you something," he said. He led her to the hidden alcove, to the box that Ghost had helped him find. He showed her the baby shoes and the handprints, the locks of hair and the report cards. And he showed her the photograph, the only image of both her sons together. His mother broke down when she saw it, years of suppressed grief finally finding release. Daniel held her while she cried, Ghost pressing against both of them, the three of them bound together by loss and love and the long road toward healing. "I thought I'd lost this," she whispered when she could speak again. "I looked for it after Thomas died, wanted to have it to remember them both, but it was gone, and I assumed it had been thrown away in the chaos of those terrible days. He saved it, Daniel said. He kept it all these years, along with everything else. I think he was trying to hold on to the life he had before everything went wrong. They talked for hours after that, sharing memories of Thomas that his mother had never been able to voice, filling in the blanks of a history that Daniel was only now learning. Ghost stayed with them throughout, his presence a comfort that required no words. When his mother left the next morning, she took with her a copy of the photograph and a promise to return. The healing that had begun was not complete, might never be fully complete, but they had made a start. The walls that his father's secrets had built were finally coming down. Ghost passed away on a quiet spring morning, 2 years after his mother's visit. The dog simply didn't wake up, slipping away in his sleep with the same dignity that had characterized his entire life. Daniel found him in his bed by the wood stove, his body still, his expression peaceful. The grief was immense, but it was also clean, the natural sorrow of losing a beloved companion at the end of a long and meaningful life. Ghost had been with Daniel for 12 years, had shared every step of the journey from darkness into light. He had been more than a pet, more than a companion. He had been a fellow warrior, a healer, a friend who had never judged and never wavered. Daniel buried him on the cliff, near the spot where his father's ashes had been scattered, with a view of the ocean that Ghost had loved to watch. The marker he placed there was simple but true. He found what was hidden and helped me find my way home. The veterans who had passed through the cabin came to pay their respects, gathering at the grave to share stories of the dog who had comforted them in their darkest moments. Helen was there, holding Daniel's hand, her presence a reminder that he was not alone. And his mother came, making the long journey to honor the animal who had been instrumental in healing the wounds that she had helped create. Daniel spoke at the gathering, his voice steady despite the tears that streamed down his face. "Ghost was a warrior," he said. "He served his country with courage and distinction, and when his military career ended, he served me. He found me when I was lost and showed me how to live again. He sniffed out the secrets that my father had hidden and helped me understand the heartbreaking truth that had been kept from me for so long. And he showed me every single day what unconditional love looks like." He paused, looking out at the ocean that stretched to the horizon. "But more than that, Ghost taught me that healing is possible. That no matter how broken we are, no matter what we've been through, there is always hope. He was discarded by the military, written off as too damaged to save. But he saved me, and he saved countless others who came through this place. He proved that the wounded can become healers, that our scars don't have to define us, that love is stronger than any trauma." The gathering dispersed slowly, people lingering to share their own memories of Ghost, to offer condolences to Daniel, to simply be present in a moment that required witnesses. By the time the sun set, casting golden light across the cliff and the grave, only Daniel and Helen remained. "What now?" she asked, her hand still in his. Daniel thought about the question, about the life that stretched before him without his constant companion. It would be different, emptier, marked by an absence that would never fully heal. But it would also be a continuation of everything that Ghost had helped him build. "We keep going," he said. "We keep the retreats running, keep helping the veterans who need this place. We honor Ghost's memory by carrying forward his work. And eventually, when the time is right, we find another dog who needs a home and give them the same chance that Ghost gave me." Helen nodded, understanding. They walked back to the cabin together, the sky darkening behind them, the first stars beginning to appear. The building was warm and welcoming, filled with the evidence of the life Daniel had built in this place where his father had hidden and where he himself had been found. On the mantel above the fireplace, a photograph now hung beside the others. It showed Daniel and Ghost standing on the cliff, looking out at the ocean, two warriors at peace with themselves and with the world. It was the last photograph taken of them together, captured by Helen just days before Ghost's passing. Below it, Daniel had placed the photograph of his father holding both his sons, the image that Ghost had helped him find in the hidden alcove. The two pictures hung side by side, past and present, loss and healing, the story of a family that had been broken by secrets and mended by truth. Daniel stood looking at them for a long moment, feeling the weight of everything that had happened since he first received the letter about his father's death. He had come here looking for answers, and Ghost had helped him find them. The truth had been heartbreaking, just as he had feared, but it had also been liberating, setting him free from the confusion and isolation that had characterized so much of his life. His father was gone now, truly gone, and so was Ghost. But their legacies lived on, in the cabin that had become a sanctuary, in the veterans who had found healing here, in the relationships that Daniel had built on the foundation of hard-won truth. "Thank you," he whispered, speaking to his father and to Ghost and to whatever force had brought them all together. "Thank you for the truth, even though it hurt. Thank you for this place, even though it came from pain. And thank you for showing me that it's never too late to start over, to heal, to find the life that was waiting for me all along." The fire crackled in the hearth, casting warm light across the room. Outside, the ocean murmured its eternal song, waves crashing against the cliffs in a rhythm that had been constant since before humans existed. And in the cabin on the cliff, where secrets had been kept and then revealed, a man who had been lost finally found his way home. The story of the father's cliff cabin and the dog who sniffed out a heartbreaking secret would be told for years to come. It would be shared at veterans support groups, written about in Daniel's blog, passed from person to person as an example of how truth, no matter how painful, was always better than deception. But for Daniel, it was simply his life, the path he had walked with a faithful companion by his side. Ghost had led him to the truth, and in doing so had given him the gift of understanding. The heartbreak had been real, but so was the healing that followed. And in the end, that was all any of them could ask for. The chance to understand, the opportunity to heal, and the love of a good dog who never stopped believing that they were worth saving.